This is the medical floor where most of the inmates stay. You got 2 orderlies that live on site, so don't hesitate to wake them up. There's usually about 10 to 20 regulars in here, and TV pretty much stays on 24/7. I nodded politely, but in reality, the next 90 days couldn't go by fast enough. The station looks out over the floor, so you pretty much just sit here and observe. Some of the old guys get a little snappish, but they're pretty chill most of the time. Officer Dorrington looked like he had fallen right out of a flower child commune and discovered that he had bills to pay and ethics to violate in the process. His hair was longer than advised. His eyes had a red tint to them that made me think he might be permanently stoned, and he talked like a basset hound giving a dissertation. He was perfect for the infirmary, a place where nothing ever happened, but it was no wonder they kept him off the compound. And of course, these monitors help you watch the show cells. There are only 2 that are occupied right now, Cell 1 and Cell 12. We usually try to fill them up from 1 to 12, but the guy in 12's been there for a little bit. He's squirrely, so if you have to open that door for any reason, make sure you got some backup. I nodded, not really paying attention, as I told him I thought I could handle it. Okay, brother, keep it chill, relax. This is the best post you'll ever sit. He offered me a fist, and I bumped it half-heartedly as he headed out. I sighed as I took the chair behind the pane of one-way glass that separated my office from the infirmary floor. I thought at the time that this was going to be the most boring 3 months of my life. Turned out I couldn't have known how wrong I would be. I'd worked at Stragview for about 5 years before I had my first really bad use of force. Happens to everyone eventually, and I'd been luckier than most in that respect. I had been working in the high custody dorm since I graduated, and my career has been a constant stream of fights, force, and cell extractions. 5 years is a long time to roll the dice, but I finally came up on Snake Eyes. We were going in to break up a fight, something I got tasked to help with pretty often, and when I put one of the guys in an arm bar, he slipped and we both went down. Next thing I knew, I was on the floor of the bathroom with a shooting pain in my shoulder, as I tried to breathe after my partner sprayed both combatants with OC. They pulled me out and got the situation under control, but I definitely torn something in my rotator cuff. Couple hours at the ER, and the doc confirmed it. 2 weeks of bed rest, your arm in an ISO cast to take the strain off your shoulder, then it's 90 days of mandatory light duty. Stragview didn't do light duty the same way other facilities did. I was told I could either ride a post for 3 months or work in the infirmary. I took the infirmary since it seemed less likely to result in me crashing a work truck into a ditch after falling asleep. Now, here I was, ready to get better fast so I could go back to running and gunning on the compound. First 4 hours, drugged by like a one-legged whore. I made sure the orderlies were doing what they were supposed to be doing, broke up a small shouting match between a couple of oldsters who both wanted to watch the TV, and discovered a paperback in the bottom drawer that looked pretty interesting. Turned out to be something from the Wheel of Time series, and I whiled away the hours as I tried to make the night go by as fast as possible. By 10 o'clock, I was ready to pound nails in with my forehead, and that was when my problem child in Cell 12 decided to wake up. I had looked in his folder before that, finding out his name was Victor Cruz. He was in for battery, and his file didn't show any of the usual earmarks for mental illness. Of course, living in this place would likely make you certifiable after a while. I was just glad he was quiet, something that seemed to be at an end. It started with some tossing and muttering. I kept an eye on him, but there's nothing to really write home about. He was having a bad dream or something. He was lying in a small nest of trash and blankets, his mat thrown into a corner as though he didn't trust it. He was naked as the day he was born, curled up like a rabbit in its den, and I could see the trash littering his cell floor. I wondered at the time why nobody cleaned his cell, the food on his wall looking equally as bad. But I'd find out soon enough. When he screamed like a banshee, I felt like I might slip out of my chair. I looked down the hall, hearing him yelling and thrashing around in the cell. I shook my head as I got up to see what the trouble was. Some of the old guys in the medical area had looked in that direction when he yelled, and a few of them shook their heads as I got up to go. They seemed to be telling me not to bother, to just let him yell himself out. But I knew if they checked the cameras and I'd just let him blow his lungs out without going to talk to him, I'd be in trouble. I arrived at the door, a big square of shatterproof glass with a handle and a food box attached, to find him going berserk in there. He was walking around, clutching his head and screaming for something to go away and leave him alone. He was looking at the corner of the cell and shouting at something that only he could see. I tried to get his attention, but he ignored me. He was shouting his lungs out, yelling his rage to the sky, but it seemed that he was unable to catch whatever it was. "Get down here and fight me! Get down here and fight me like a man!" he screamed. I tried to get his attention a few more times, but ultimately I just walked back to the desk and kept an eye on him between pages. He wasn't hurting himself, and wasn't really bothering me either. If he wanted to stomp around his cell all night and yell at ghosts, then that was his business, and I wasn't going to stand in his way. He went right on yelling for another hour before flopping onto the toilet and hanging his head in defeat. Figured he was probably out for a while, so I went back to my book. This was far from the last time I would hear from him. He would pick up again an hour later, and then an hour after that, and every performance would end with him sitting on the cold metal toilet as he huffed and puffed. I kept at it, trying to get through the night as best I could, and when Officer Dorrington came back and asked how it had gone, I told him it had been okay, other than Cruz. "Poor dude," he said with a little head shake. "You know, it didn't used to be that bad. He threatened to hurt himself, and somebody took him seriously, so they put him in cell 3. He's fine in there. He just tried to sleep for the remainder of his observation, but when the water main burst in the hall, we had to put him in cell 12. After that, he seemed to get worse by the day. His mental health really took a nosedive, and it's probably going to keep him back here for longer than expected." I nodded, only half listening, but kind of focusing on the last part of what Dorrington had said. "So how long has he been in room 12? Dorrington thought about it for a minute or two before shrugging. "Guess about 3 weeks, less than a month. They keep talking about letting him go, but he's come to the point where he may have to go to a psych camp." I took my leave after that, but I just couldn't get the idea out of my head. Had inmate Cruz always been crazy, or was it something to do with the room? I remembered his face as he looked for the source of the voices, and the way he kept looking into the corner made me wonder if there might be more to it than that. The next night was more of the same, but I knew it'd be the last night for a couple of days. I had to work this weekend, and I propped myself up with the knowledge that even if it was a really bad night, I'd have a couple of days off to look forward to. Dorrington said it had been a pretty quiet day, and that Cruz had taken a shot from a nurse around noon and would probably be asleep all night. I thanked him for the good news, my fist bump a little more enthusiastic this time, and settled in for a mostly quiet evening of reading and rounds. It lasted until about 3 o'clock, when another loud scream ushered in the start of the trouble. I looked up to find Cruz yelling at the wall again, as he jumped up to punch something just out of reach. I ignored him for a little while, but then I looked up to find him leaping off the toilet to get a higher punch, and I sighed as I marked my page and went to investigate. "Cruz," I yelled, each jump resulting in a less graceful landing than the one before. "Stop it, before you hurt yourself." He ignored me, as I had been sure he would, and I repeated it another 2 times before grabbing for my radio to try to get some help. That's when he landed badly, and I heard his ankle snap through the door. My request for help became a little more frantic, and I looked back to find him still staring at the corner. His face was less angry now, and more fearful as he backed away on his butt and made for the door. That was good. It would mean that I could scoop him up when he got closer, but as I glanced back at the corner, I caught a brief glimpse of something that didn't make sense. It was a smoky face sitting midway up the wall, a grinning, demonic face that winked at me before disappearing completely. When help arrived, I was still looking for that face, but I straightened up as they got in position to grab him. He seemed almost thankful to be away from it, and we got him cuffed and had medical assess him. They determined that it was good and broke, and suggested he be sent to the hospital. So they packed him off to the ER, and I was short one crazy for the rest of my shift. It would have been nice to be rid of all that screaming, but with the cell empty, I started noticing other things. It was like there was a moth stuck in there, and I would see weird flashes of movement more often than I should. There was a weird whisper, too, a voice that I thought was the TV, but never seemed to have a source. It was always whispering at me like someone talking quietly in another room. And by the time my relief got there, a guy named Tinsdale, I was feeling more than a little rattled myself. I tried to put it out of my mind while I was off, but it was hard to shake. And after a few days off, I was almost glad to hear a familiar banging coming from cell 12 as I came back to work. Dorrington was at the desk, making notes on the clipboard, and when I mentioned that it sounded like Cruz was back from the hospital, he nodded. "Saw him on the way in, huh? Yeah, they put him in 3 when he came back. He's been quiet ever since, and it seems like the hospital might have been good for him." I must have looked confused, because Dorrington handed me a folder with a picture of a different inmate on it. "This is Mathers. They brought him in Thursday after he did some light cutting in confinement. They say he started yelling at breakfast time, and he's just trying to fight thin air all day." I looked down and realized this was an inmate that I knew. Mathers was what we traditionally called a bug in corrections. He was in his early 20s and convinced that he was a real badass. He'd been in and out of confinement for everything from fighting to drugs, and he'd been taken out of my wing about a week before my accident. The report said that he had been cutting for attention, and mental health had decided that some time in a show cell might be good for him. It hadn't, but the wheels of justice are often slow to realize that your screams as you were ground under them were not the happy squeals of recovery. The whole shift, I kept looking between 3 and 12, the inhabitants a stark contrast between each other. Cruz now appeared to be the picture of calm. He did little beyond sit against the wall and read his Bible, looking around placidly whenever someone came near the door. He even waved at me a few times when I looked in on him during my rounds. And I wondered if he remembered being that screaming other that I had seen a few days ago. This was the Cruz that Dorrington had been lamenting, and I could see why. If you hadn't told me that he was the same man, I would have had no idea. Mathers, on the other hand, was far worse than I'd ever seen him. Mathers had always been a problem child, but his antics now were less that of a child seeking attention and more those of a mental patient. He had already thrown his food against the wall, and I noticed that most of it was in one particular corner. If you were looking through the door, it would have been the back left corner, the same one that Cruz had been shouting into a few nights ago. He would oscillate between sleeping, fitfully pacing around, mumbling, and yelling at things that only he could see, sometimes in a matter of seconds. Mathers got worse as the night progressed, but his anger was always targeted at that specific corner. When Dorrington arrived the next morning, I had more questions. Mathers hadn't been the only thing that I'd seen on camera in that cell last night. There had been a movement present that had drawn my eye several times. It looked more like a light reflection than a moth or anything, if you had watched it. Mathers followed it with his eyes, as if he could see it too, though. Once or twice I looked up in time to see something large and shadowy hovering in that corner, but it was always gone before I could study it much. Dorrington seemed interested when I wanted to ask him some questions, and he must have hoped that I'd found something interesting in the infirmary. "What's the story with Cell 12? I asked, getting right to the point. "What you mean?" "I mean, has anything ever happened in there? It seems like Mathers spent most of the night looking around and talking to something that only he could see. And I'm wondering if that's just normal for people in there. I didn't know Cruz, but I know Mathers, and that's abnormal behavior for him." Dorrington nodded slowly. "To be honest with you, I've only worked on the compound for a couple of months. I was pretty bad at it. I'm kind of a softie, but when they stuck me in here, I really took to it. I've spent most of my career in the infirmary, so I haven't really gotten a good feel for most of the inmates. What I have noticed is that people in Cell 12 seem to behave a little strangely. Like I said, I don't know them out on the compound real well, but now that you mention it, they don't seem very happy to be in there." I nodded, now pretty sure it wasn't just me. "So what's the story with Cell 12? "I don't know," Dorrington said, "but I have an idea who would. Let me ask some of the old-timers back here. Some of these guys have been here long enough to retire, if they'd been drawing a paycheck, and they've probably seen way more than either of us. I'll ask around and let you know something tonight." I wasn't sure how much stock I was willing to put in first-hand accounts by inmates, but I was interested to see what Dorrington would find out. When I came back that night, Dorrington pointed to a particularly old fella sitting in bed 7 and said that was my guy. I talked to him a little bit, but he said he'd prefer to tell you himself. I must have made a face, because Dorrington gave me the first hard look I'd ever seen on the man. "He's not a leper. He knows what you're looking for, and he only wants a little bit of your time to tell you." "Can't you just tell me?" I asked, really not wanting to play inmate games tonight. "I could, but I won't. If you want to know so bad, then go to ask him. Otherwise, I guess you'll just never know." He left after that, looking like I'd insulted him somehow. Dorrington and I were on opposite ends of the spectrum. He was one of those guys who thought his charges were real people, but I'd always kept a healthy distance from the animals. I would ask them things, and sometimes I would even believe the information they gave me, but I always took everything I was told by these guys with a grain of salt. Most of them would lie to you if they thought it would get them something, but it was a little different back here. Most of them had everything they wanted. When they were in medical, they had plenty to eat, reliable heat and AC, a bed with relatively safe expectations of not being murdered or assaulted in their sleep. And as the night went on, and I listened to the banging from Cell 12, it only heightened my curiosity. As it crept closer to master roster count, I finally decided to go and talk to the old-timer and see what he knew. The old man's name was Williamson, and his chart said that he was 98. Inmates in their 90s are as rare as inmates off medication, and Williamson was likely an endangered species in a place like this. He had come to medical about 10 years ago after a stroke had taken most of his mobility, and it was probably the only reason that he hadn't died of a cold or after smarting off to one of these young Turks out here. He was awake when I came out onto the floor, and he raised his hand slowly as he shook it at me. He knew why I was there. Most of them probably did. And as I took a seat next to him, I was surprised to find that he didn't hold that medicine smell or the smell of barely contained filth that a lot of them do. Most mobile inmates aren't particularly clean, but this fella smelled downright sociable. "Took you long enough. I was just about to drift off again. Once my medication hits in about an hour, there won't be much use asking Grandpa for a story." I took a look at his cataract old eyes to see if he was senile or just poking fun at me, and decided it was the latter. I told him to tell me about room 12, if he actually knew anything about it, that was. He smiled as if we both knew that he did, and got comfortable against his pillows. "Oh, more than some," he boasted. "Been back here on and off since I was 65. Been living in Stragview for most of my life, and I've seen and done things that would turn your hair as white as mine. I'm in here for murdering my wife and my brother, whom I found in bed together. Judge wanted to go easy on me, but my brother's wife said there was evidence that I had known before catching him in the act. I hadn't, but my brother seemed to think I did. She brought out his journal talking about how I had known and even been okay with it, but whether it was a lie or just delusion on his part, who's to say? I've got a round to do in about 30 minutes, old-timer. I'm here to hear about Cell 12, not your life story. The old man snorted. Well, too bad. You want to hear what I have to say, then you'll hear it on my terms. I'd stop interrupting if I were you. That nurse gave me my pills about an hour ago, and I've only got about 30 minutes before they kick in, and I'm comatose. I wanted to get mad, but it was the old guy's story, I guess, and I just had to let him tell it. Told him to tell it, and he went on. I was 28 when I caught my wife and my brother together, so I've been in Stragview for 70 years, I guess. In that time, I've seen a lot, and part of it was while I was an orderly here in the infirmary. I was looking 50 right in the face and decided it might be time to slow down a little bit. I'd worked just about every job in the prison, but the infirmary seemed like a nice little rest before somebody stuck a knife in me. I was making hooch and selling what inmates here call weed, and it was only a matter of time before my competition got tired of my meddling and decided to put me out of business. I'd worked at the hospital before getting arrested, and mopping floors and changing bedpans was not work I was unfamiliar with. So I spent about 10 years wiping asses and emptying catheter bags and keeping the place tidy. It was 1984 when they wheeled the fella in. He was about the worst looking mother I had ever seen. They had him in restraints with a spit mask covering his face and a man on each arm. He's bald as an egg and his head was covered in tattoos. Not the usual tattoos you see on bald white guys, but symbols and weird words. It was all stuff that a wizard might need for spells, and he looked like whatever he was casting with those symbols wasn't good for much of anybody. They put him in cell 12 and told the officer sitting in the booth to keep an eye on him. They said his name was Malik O'Dare, and he was spending 5 days in Stragview until a detachment from Macklemore could come to pick him up. Macklemore used to be one of the largest medical prisons in the region, and they were getting ready to shove him in a little box and study him until he was dead. Then they'd probably dissect his brains. They could study him after he was dead too, but that was beyond my understanding. So, for 4 days and 4 nights, Malik made their lives a living hell. He would bite himself and draw on the walls in his own blood. He would try to grab anyone that he could lay hands on, and they quickly learned that he didn't get visits from medical or food in a regular tray. After his second meal at Stragview, all his food came in a bag, and the orders were that the bag not be sent in either. They dumped the food into the little box outside the cell. Then you close the top and open the inner gate, and if he decided to take it, well, that was on him. He tried to flood the cell twice, succeeded once, pissed and shit under the door often. Amidst all the chaos, he continued to draw the weird symbols on the wall in his blood. But since he wasn't bleeding bad enough to be sent out for psychiatric evaluation, and they knew that Macklemore was coming to get him Monday, he was allowed to continue. The drawing in his own blood was nothing next to the other stuff he was doing, and it went mostly unnoticed, for the most part. If he was drawing, he was quiet. Most of them thought it was nothing anyway. I asked one of the guards what he was here for, and they told me that the things Malik O'Dare was here for made my crimes look like stealing candy off of kitties. He'd been running some kind of cult over by Donahue, real Jim Jones type of deal. They got up to some pretty heinous things in the time they spent together. human sacrifice and cannibalism and stuff with kids I'd rather not talk about. The whole shebang. It was crowned by the plan for mass suicide, and fortunately, someone caught him in time. He was going to have all 50 of his followers kill themselves on the blood moon, but before he could, the feds came in and stopped him. He tried to off himself a few times while he was in jail, but the judge finally handed him a death sentence, and he was remanded into federal custody. He'd been in a federal institution for the last 5 years, in a little room by himself without a lot of human interaction. But McLemore had paid him a mint for the right to study him before the feds carried out his death sentence. The feds had agreed to give him a stay of execution for a while and let McLemore house and study him for the next 5 years. Whatever hell he raised, well, that was none of the feds' business. He yawned loudly, but covered it with the back of his hand. I better give you the abridged version, 'cause I'm going to be asleep before long. It appeared that Malik never had any intention of going to McLemore. Being in Stragview was his last chance to escape the system on his own terms. And boy, did he. On the 4th night, the day before they was gonna come get him, he started yelling and chanting loudly. This wasn't new. Inmates in the show cell usually yell a lot, but some of the stuff he was yelling wasn't the usual rambling nonsense you heard. I peeked in on him and saw that he was sitting in his floor with his legs in an Indian pose. He was chanting in a language that I'd never heard, and as he did, the things he had drawn on the wall were blinking and glowing. I tried to tell the guard, but he told me to get back to work and mind my own business. There wasn't much else to do but obey or get sent to confinement and lose my job, so I got back to work. I saw the same guard get up in a hurry about 2 hours later, round about midnight actually, and bang on the door of cell 12 as he called for Malik to get up. He got on the radio and called for help, and when help got there, they discovered that Malik was dead. Medical decided it had been a stroke, and he'd probably swallowed his tongue during the fit. McLemore never got a chance to study him while he was alive. There was a huge investigation by the feds into Stragview. Fortunately for Stragview, at least, they had cameras in the cell back then, too. They weren't as fancy as the ones they got now. Tapes had to be changed twice a shift, but they got most of what happened on video. It was decided that the prison was not at fault, but I think the guard at the time still got fired. Probably an ass-covering maneuver, but nothing else really came of it. After that, anyone else they put in that cell has claimed to see things and hear voices. They get crazy within a few days, and the longest I've ever seen someone hold out was a week. I have lain in this bed and listened to them go mad. Sometimes I can even hear the same voice I heard whispering those arcane words so long ago. He's still in there somehow. He's become in death what he always wanted to be in life. An agent of chaos. Maybe that's what he was praying for in whatever language he was speaking. Just the ability to torment as many people in death as he had in life. I guess we'll never know. The old guy yawned again, flapping his hands at me in dismissal. I'm tired now, son. Go on. Let an old man sleep. I've been sitting here thinking about that story for the last few hours. I have a friend who works in the control room, and when I called to ask him about an inmate named Malik O'Dare, he said that O'Dare was a bit of Stragview lore that a lot of people knew about. He had died here, but the story about his crimes and the nature of his death were something that people thought had been exaggerated. When I asked him if he died in a show cell here in medical, he said that that was true. He asked me why I was curious, and I lied and said it was something that an inmate had told me. Well, I guess it wasn't much of a lie. I've been watching the camera for cell 12 as I write in my notebook. That fluttering movement I told you about has become something different. It's like a swirl of smog, moving from corner to corner. And sometimes, a pair of bright pinpricks will look up at me from the depths of the gas. It's like he knows that I know what he is, and that knowledge means that he's taken notice of me. I can hear the whispers at my desk, especially when it's quiet, and if that's what the inmates are hearing in that cell, then I can understand why they go crazy. I'm not sure how long I can listen to those whispers, and seeing that strange face as it looks at me through the camera lens. I suppose maybe I'll be ready for a show cell soon too. Hopefully cell 12 isn't empty if they decide to hold me here until the psych ward can come and collect me. I'd thought these 90 days would be tough, but now it seems my career may not be the only thing I'm in danger of losing. I knew he was going to be trouble from the first time he stepped on the quad. Stragview had just gotten over COVID, the plague the world was still wary about, and inmates were on high alert. Something most people don't understand is that when your population is limited to about 1,000 guys in the same pool of disease, your immune system isn't as durable as it once was. A cold or the flu can sometimes put down a whole dorm like it never would on the street. And if they get it, then they know it only came from two places. You can't get something from the bubble once you're in the bubble. So sickness either comes from the guards or new inmates, and they know it. A pod can usually tell who's sick and with what quicker than we can, and sometimes they'll quarantine an inmate or push them out before they can get everyone else sick. It actually happened not long ago, and it started a riot that killed 3 COs, 30 inmates, and sent a lot from both camps to the infirmary with injuries. It had all started because of lockdown and sick inmates, and no one wanted to see it happen again. So, when they brought in inmate Clarion, I sighed audibly. God damn it, I cursed, and Jackson looked up to see what had caught my eye. What? It's just a new guy. Is he starting trouble already? He is trouble, I said, watching the other inmates as they marked him. Officer Gerber pushed him into the quad, H3 to be exact, and he stumbled out there with his mat and his bedroll and a look that made me think of lost puppies. He was pale, very pale, and his eyes looked sunken as if he hadn't been sleeping well. He was scrawny, almost emaciated, and I didn't like the way he winced and rubbed his belly. His stomach was the biggest part of him, and it protruded against the front of his uniform shirt like a balloon. It looked like the stomach of a much larger man, but it wasn't until I'd been watching him for a while that I finally put my finger on it. His stomach reminded me of a pregnant woman's stomach. Johnson looked past me, focusing on the new guy as he tried to find his cell, and finally just shrugged. Looks fine to me, you're just paranoid, he said, as he went back to his paperwork. I wish I had been. The next day, I was approached by inmate Pelichek, the houseman for the quad, telling me he needed to change cells. I looked at my roster and realized he was inmate Clarion's new roommate, and felt the same creeping dread I had the day before. Why? You've been in that cell for as long as I can remember. It's him or me, and I know how this works. If you'll move me, he can just have the cell. Why? Did he snore or something? Pelichek shuddered like someone had dumped cold water on him. If that were all it was, it would be fine. No, the man is not right. He talks to himself at night. Talks like he's talking to a baby. I woke up this morning after finally going to sleep, and he was sitting on the toilet and rubbing his stomach as he talked. He shut up when he noticed me seeing him, but I will not share a room with him. The man is crazy, and my mother always told me that crazy is catching. I gave Pelichek a skeptical look. No mean feat when the man is 6'2", but I could see he wasn't joking. Pellicek is a long-term resident, an ex-Russian national who's in prison for 30 years for beating a man to death in a bar fight. His claim of self-defense was enough to save him from a life sentence, but not enough to convince the jury that caving in the man's skull had been self-defense. The guy was huge. I'd seen him trading his carbs for boiled eggs most every morning before eating a dozen or so of them and working out most of the day. If this guy was freaked out, then Clarion must be pretty weird. The only cell I got's with Mueller, and you know he snores like a buzzsaw. Better the buzzsaw than that, Pellicek said, thanking me before leaving to pack his things. 30 minutes later, he was moving the last of his stuff into Mueller's cell, trading his bottom bunk for a top bunk with a loud snore. I started watching Clarion after that, trying to figure out what had spooked Pellicek so bad, and I noticed other inmates giving him a wide berth. He ate alone, choosing to sit at a table they seemed to have designated for him. He kept to his cell mostly, seeming to prefer solitude. He received no mail, no phone calls, and he only went out direct when he was forced to. He didn't seem to like the sun much, and slept during the day unless asked to get up. His stomach neither grew or shrank, his skin remained pale, and the bruises stayed around his eyes. I looked him up, something I didn't do often, and found out he was here for murder. He had apparently murdered his sister, but the circumstances were pretty murky. Clarion had been something of a hermit, living in the woods in a little shack, and only coming into town when absolutely necessary. He had been doing this for decades, but when he hadn't been seen in town for a week, his sister had ventured to his cabin to check on him. When she hadn't come back, the police had gone to check on them both and found something pretty grisly. The body of Sara Clarion had been found under the cabin. She'd been drained of all her fluids, all the nutrients in her body, and the coroner had said that it looked like someone had sucked her dry like a juice box. Stephen Clarion, her brother, was the only person on the property, and he had admitted to moving the body, but not to the murder. Police felt sure it was him somehow, and he'd been charged thusly. Now he was Stragview's problem, one of many, and the police in Hiawassee got to pretend that they had actually done something. Regardless, I still had to take care of the man, and I would. I soon discovered what Pellicek had meant when he said Clarion had been talking to himself. He didn't keep a roommate longer than a week the whole time I knew him, and that was only about a month. They all said the same thing. He was strange. He stared at them. He talked to himself. He sang to himself, but it all shook out to the fact that they thought he was crazy. So, one night, as I was doing a round, I came to his cell, and sure enough, Clarion was singing to himself. He had been there about a week and a half at this point, and I hadn't seen him do much more than sleep or stare off into space. Jackson said he had caught some singing, but he had mostly ignored it. Not much got to Jackson. He was old hat at this, but I was still a little curious about the mysteries this place sometimes held. So I got closer to his cell, and I recognized what he was singing. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Daddy's gonna buy you a mockingbird." I turned my flashlight off and crept up, listening as he sang to himself. "And if that mockingbird don't sing, Daddy's gonna buy you a diamond ring." I leaned around to the little window on the cell, trying to get a peek at him, and saw him sitting on the toilet, rubbing his stomach. "And if that diamond ring turns brass, Daddy's gonna buy you a looking glass." He was rubbing something on his stomach, lotion or oil, and crooning to it. The light coming from the overhead in there was dim, little more than a nightlight, but I watched him, mesmerized as he stroked his stomach and sang. "And if that looking glass gets broke, Daddy's gonna buy you a billy goat." As he touched his stomach, I could see something move beneath his hand. It was like ropes beneath his skin, like eels in a pot, and it seemed to touch his hand almost lovingly. With his shirt off, I could see how thin his chest was compared to the rest of him. It was sunken in, the bones jutting against his skin, but the stomach beneath it was still swollen and distended. And if that billy goat won't pull, Daddy's gonna... I must have made a noise or leaned against the door too hard, because he suddenly looked up, and I pushed myself out of the window and leaned against the door as I prayed he wouldn't come looking. What I'd seen had been terrifying, but the thought of him seeing me was even worse. I didn't know what he had within him, but it was bad enough that I didn't want him to know that I had seen it. The next night, we came in to find him in a corner of the day room. It seemed he had decided to come out of his shell. "See," Jackson said, "he's settling in. I knew all it would take was a little time." He came out of his shell, but it might have been better if he hadn't. For the next 3 weeks, more than one inmate began to complain about being sick. A ton of sick calls suddenly went in, and medical was swamped with complaints of people being sluggish, having no energy, and generally feeling bad. A nurse told me it appeared they had anemia, and a lot of them had low iron counts. I didn't know much about that, but I knew that the pale skin and the black circles under their eyes looked very familiar. I wasn't the only one who noticed either. Bryce, another long-term resident of H-Dorm, started spreading it around that Clarion had something catching. The sick people looked like he did, and that couldn't be a coincidence. They had to do something about it. They had to stop it from happening, and it had something to do with inmate Clarion. I was pretty sure they were right, too. I'd seen Clarion go in and out of cells all week, leaving before too much stir could be made, and the inmate would always go to the infirmary the next day. Unfortunately, Bryce did not handle it the way he should have. He attacked Clarion in the quad, in full view of the officer station, while both of us were in the bubble. I had seen Bryce and about 6 others shooting dark looks at Clarion as he stood in the corner by the kiosk. I was sort of new, but not new enough that I couldn't recognize something about to go south real hard. Jackson shook his head, claiming I was just looking for trouble, but I didn't think so. Jackson finally got tired of me just watching them and tossed me some paperwork, telling me I could do a little work if I meant to just sit around. I looked up after hearing someone yell and saw them backing Clarion towards the door as he put his hands up defensively. I cursed, seeing the knife in Bryce's hand, and told Jackson to call a code blue. Jackson grabbed his radio as I went running, and I'd come into the hallway between the quads as I heard Clarion begging for his life. I was fumbling keys, trying to find the right one, when I heard him say something that chilled me to the bone. "Don't do it. I can't be held responsible for what happens if you do." "Bullshit," Bryce said. "You ain't gonna do nothing." "Please, I'm begging you, don't..." But he grunted, and I figured Clarion had been stabbed. I had the key in the lock when a shadow fell over me. I looked up to see something long and white and slithering as it rose above the assembled men. They began to run, but not fast enough. The thing was rising out of a hole in Clarion, a jagged knife wound in his stomach. It looked like a worm, or a tentacle maybe, and it was thicker than it had any right to be. I thought it was one big something, but when it separated, I could see that it was actually many slithering white things. They shot out and caught the men, wrapping around them as they tore them to pieces. Blood hit the floor, followed by parts of people, and as they were torn up, other writhing things began to fall on the blood and suck it off the ground. It was mesmerizing, the way it cleaned them up, and I saw how it drained the parts of fluid as well. "Just like it had done to his sister," said a whispery little voice in the back of my head. The team came in to find me on the floor, the key still in my hand, with nothing but withered inmate parts lying around the place, and a terrified Clarion huddled against the door as he covered his face. I explained in a shaky voice what I had seen, but medical found no wounds on Clarion at all. Other inmates were questioned, but Most of them claimed they hadn't seen anything, the typical Stragview line. Inmates wouldn't have admitted to seeing a UFO most of the time, and if there was camera footage, I never saw it. The mess was cleaned up, the bodies were disposed of, families were notified, and life went on. I was given a few days to recuperate, and when I came back, Clarion was no longer my problem. He wasn't any dorm's problem, and had seemingly disappeared from Stragview altogether. I never learned what happened to him, but I think about him sometimes, and wonder what became of him. I also wonder about whatever it was that came out of him to protect him. The way it drank all that blood from its attackers, it has to be taking a toll on him as well. I wonder how long it'll be before Clarion is no more, and it's forced to find a new host to befriend. He watched as the town of Kashmir disappeared as the bus drove into the all-too-familiar woods that surrounded the prison. In a way, this was an odd kind of homecoming for him. How many times had he driven this road to get to work? How many times had he yawned as he got off work, trying to keep his eyes open as he drove to his apartment at the Whispering Pines apartment complex? The windows had the dark tint on them, the kind that no one could see through, and that was a blessing. If anyone had known he was on that bus, they might have formed a blockade and just hung him right there in the park. Some of the residents of Kashmir would have probably eaten picnic lunches while he breathed his last. It was pretty short notice, but there might have even been commemorative t-shirts. After all, it wasn't every day the nightclub killer came home to stay. He reflected that they might not even recognize him if they'd seen him from the windows of the prison bus. He had spent most of his trial and confinement at the tiny jailhouse they had in Cummings. The guards knew who he was, knew what he was, and they had been more than happy to mistreat him now that there was nothing he could do about it. His food had been thrown on the floor at least once a day. His commissary had been lost more than a few times, and he thought it likely that he had lost 50 pounds in that little cell. Didn't really matter. When your life was restricted to an 8x8 cell that you never got to leave, very little mattered at all. He'd done endless push-ups, sit-ups, and crunches. He'd eaten bugs when he was hungry, something the jail had in abundance, and drank water more often than not when the bugs weren't plentiful. He looked like a new man, like a different man, and he doubted anyone that he had known before would recognize him when he came back. He came back to Stragview, not through the front gate, as he had so many times before, but through the sliding metal gate that ushered the new inmates into their life of shadow and violence. The buses were usually full, but today there was a slim roster indeed. Besides him, shackled to the seat behind a cage at the back of the bus, there were 8 others. One of them, a pedophile who had tried to talk to him for the first week before finally giving up, had been someone he'd seen at jail when he'd spent the last 8 months there, but the rest were strangers. People passing time in this place, some of them never to see the light of day again. That was all they were. Not like him. Not special. He was special, and everyone knew it. The new fish in the front of the bus were herded off, the COs yelling and swearing at them as they hustled them out and lined them up. He assumed he would be next, taken to stand with them, but as they filed into the orientation building, his restraints were still in place. He started to get worried. This wasn't how things usually were. Would they take him straight to his dorm? Maybe they didn't think someone who had been part of Stragview's daily operation needed to be oriented. Maybe, he dared to think, they might give him a welcome that befits someone who had once walked amongst them and had now fallen so far. He was starting to get worried that they would just leave him here for the night, when 2 guards he knew came striding onto the bus. Sergeant McCowan and Officer Gerber were in the category of COs that fell under the heading of not to be fucked with. McGowan was about 5'6", but he was as wide as he was tall, with arms like a longshoreman. Gerber was less intimidating, but he was an ex-Marine, and he was no stranger to violence. The look he gave Gerber didn't shake the man in the least, but he had a special grievance against him. Gerber, Nosy Gerber, had been part of the reason he was here at all. If it hadn't been for Gerber and his need to put his nose where it didn't belong, he might have gotten a less harsh sentence. "Inmate B50967, Sergeant McCowan growled. "The warden wants to see you. Are you going to comply, or are we going to drag you across the concrete?" Inmate B50967 didn't bother answering. He just nodded and held his hands out to be uncuffed. "Guess again, superstar. Those hands stay shackled, legs too. But we will be unhooking you from the bus, since you can't very well take it with you. You so much as lift that foot before I tell you to, and the warden can visit you in the infirmary for all I care. You feel me?" Inmate B50967 nodded, and when the 2 of them caught him under the arms, he rose, amiably enough, and let them escort him to see the warden. McCowan called it in over the radio, letting the guards on the yard know that he had a bad guy on the way that needed a clear shot. B50967 walked up the same concrete path he had taken to his dorm every night, right up until Gerber had discovered his little secret, and though the inmates faced away from him, he could hear them whisper to themselves as he passed. "That's him. That's the guard-turned-killer. The one from E-Dorm? They say he killed 7 women before they caught him. Shit, think he needs a gang to watch his back? What's his name again? Who knows? Just another stinking guard who slipped up. It's the only difference between us and them anyway. They didn't get caught as often as we did." B50967 listened to them whisper the whole way to the tower, but when the procession suddenly stopped, he looked down to see who had been stupid enough to get in their way. He looked down to find a familiar orange wraith looking up at him with big green inquisitive eyes. All the guards knew about old One-Ear, all the inmates too, but most of them never got close to him. There had been one, he seemed to remember, and he had paid the price for the friendship. B50967 knew guards who brought cat food in their bags in an attempt to entice the old orange Tom, but he'd never seen a guard get close enough to pet the old compound cat. When it twined between his legs, giving his ankles a quick nuzzle, B50967 knew that something significant had happened. It seemed the cat didn't think of him as a guard anymore, and he had been accepted as one of the rabble. The cat swiped at McGowan in passing, but as he ready to boot to kick out at it, the cat shot off like a bolt of lightning and disappeared over the fence into the rabbit run. "Spooky," the old sergeant said, but if Gerber agreed, he gave no indication. They led him to the looming edifice that now stood as the warden's permanent residence, and as they came through the gate, McCowan told Gerber that he could go. "No need for both of us to have to wander into this spooky place. I'll meet you in the captain's office when it's time for lunch," he promised, and the officer seemed more than happy to be done with this particular detail. As the tower gate closed, locking both McGowan and the inmate inside, the old sergeant turned back to him, his warmth disappearing. "You act up," McGowan promised, opening the door and pushing him in, "and I can promise you that I'll lose you in confinement. This ain't something that happens often. Very few inmates come into the tower to speak with the warden, and if you aren't absolutely respectful, I might bounce your head off the steps before I drag you to the box. You understand?" B50967 nodded, a slow up and down, and McGowan led him up the stairs to the very top. The climb was all the more difficult because of the shackles on his legs. but he would be damned if he let McGowan know that he was discomforted. The weak and hectic thing that he had once been was gone, along with his old name. He was B50967 now, and if it didn't fit, then he was sure that after a couple of decades in this place, it would. They came to a round wooden door at the top of the stairs, and when McGowan knocked, a cultured voice told them to enter. B50967 came into the warden's office with the clink of chains and the sound of Chopin. The old recorder player was warbling out the sound of the old master as he plied his craft, and B50967 was unsurprised to see a familiar orange tom sitting on the desk and purring under the warden's gentle hand. He knew those hands could turn cruel if they wanted to, and when the old man turned those expressive red eyes on him, he shuddered all over. "Ah, there you are. I wanted to see how you were, given that you used to be one of mine in a very different sense. Thank you, Sergeant. You may go now." McGowan blinked. "Sir, I'm not supposed to—" "You are supposed to do as instructed, Sergeant. Do you think I can't handle a man, shackled hand to wrist if I need to? I've been throwing inmates around since before you were born." McGowan gave his charge a hard look, promising violence if he acted up, but it appeared he was far more afraid of the man in the pinstriped suit sitting behind the huge oak desk. "I'll be right outside," McGowan promised, closing the door behind him as he stepped onto the landing. That just left the warden and his new charge, alone with the orange tomcat. "Cribs, Cribs, Cribs," the warden intoned like a disappointed father. "It pains me to see you like this, especially when we both know you were just giving them what they deserved, weren't you?" B50967 said nothing. He just sat with his hands in his lap and the chain swinging from his ankles. "After all, you were the stronger, the more cunning. Why shouldn't you have killed them? Your only crime was hubris. Really, leaving a trail like that on a work computer. It's like you were asking to get caught. Although your incarceration helps me more than you can imagine." He looked up to find the warden grinning at him, his face locked in a predatory smirk that he always wore. "You see, I need something done around here. A little housekeeping, if you will. There are people here who are undermining the structure I've put in place. They are beholden to something that isn't in the best interests of this facility, and I want it to stop. I want you to stop it, Cribs." B50967 shook his head, pointing to the little ID card that was clipped to his chest. "Cribs is dead," he said, his voice rusty after months of silence. "I'm nothing but a number now. The man who sat in the dorm and wrote in that little journal is gone. I just want to live what life I can with the time I have." The warden nodded. "I suppose there's something to that. Many people find peace in a place like this. I don't think you're one of those people, however." The smirk was gone now, the playful attitude had evaporated, and the warden was ready to make a deal, it seemed. B50967 wondered if his soul would be the currency for this transaction. "You didn't kill those women because it brought you peace. You weren't trying to tip the scales of right or wrong. You killed them because you wanted to, and you never work without a purpose. So allow me to give you a purpose. I have a list of 12 men who have a combined sentence of 730 years. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's the exact same amount of time the judge gave you for your crimes. He likely thought himself clever. No one could survive 700 years, and that is what I intend to make sure of. These men have to die, so you can live, so you can go back to the life you left behind. Whether you return to killing or whether you return to something less likely to bring you back here again is up to you. But it's an opportunity for life, and that is something. What do you say? Keep in mind, this isn't an offer I make twice." He didn't ask what the men had done. He didn't ask how the warden would release him without repercussions. And he didn't ask why the warden would ask something like this of him. At the end of the day, B50967 didn't care. The promise of freedom, of stalking the night once again, of hunting worthy prey, was enough for him. "I accept," he said, and the warden's smile was more predatory than the grin of a hyena. As McCowan took him to his new home, the warden telling him that he would be in touch, B50967 reflected on his new purpose. 12 men seemed an acceptable trade for his life, and he found himself chuckling a little as McCowan scowled at him. "What's so funny, killer?" he asked. "Or is it finally settling in that you've ruined your life for what exactly? A little slash and splash?" "I was just thinking how nice it'll be to get back home," he said. And when the door to H4 slammed shut behind him, he knew it was true. He put his things in cell 18, empty except for him, and as he lay on the bunk, he wondered how long it would be before the warden contacted him. A day, a week, a year, made no difference. He would be ready. Jasper frowned as he read over the letter, the summons looking like no other mail he'd ever received. "On Saturday, you are summoned to attend midnight visitation as part of your rehabilitation. Attendance is non-negotiable, and refusal will result in forced attendance, followed by time spent in solitary. Be ready by no later than 11. The Warden." "Whoa, that's pretty cool," said Gavin, reading over his shoulder. "Who do you know that would come all the way down here at midnight to see you?" Jasper didn't know, and he told him as much. He was in here for killing the last person who'd given a crap about him, and he couldn't think of anyone who would make the trip in the daytime, let alone at night. His parents had disowned him after he'd killed her, and most of his family refused to have anything to do with him. Some of his cousins would still accept his letters, but few of them would bother to write back. Jasper was perplexed by the invitation, but by the sound of it, it wasn't much of an invitation anyway. Attendance seemed to be mandatory, and he was pretty sure that most of the guards on the compound would enjoy dragging him there in chains. The letter had come with their mail, and it was one of the few times the guard had called his name. The last year and a half had been difficult for Jasper, but he was getting used to making it on his own. He'd done it all his life, hadn't he? His mom and dad had been too busy with their own things to care about their middle child. Barbara was the smart one, Reggie was the athletic people person, and Jasper was the screw-up. His grades had never been too good, his achievements few and far between, and when Grace had come into the picture, his parents figured it was the best Jasper could do. Jasper had agreed with them. Grace had been everything from the moment she agreed to go steady with him. Grace was motivated, a natural saleswoman who had strived for something more than middle management. She had a successful business by the time she graduated college, and Jasper was happy to stay at home and keep the house. Jasper provided her with stability, someone to come home to who lacked the means to do any better, but he couldn't give her the one thing she wanted. That's why she left him. That's why he'd had to kill her. He couldn't stand to be apart from her, couldn't stand for her to be with somebody else. And now, he was stuck in Stragview for his lapse in judgment. That's what made the note so cryptic, and the longer he thought about it, the shorter the list of people who would come all the way here at night became. He did a little more than wait, he supposed. Jasper asked around about the midnight visitation, but no one seemed to know much about it. The younger guys all shook their heads, and the older guys clammed up when you asked about it. It was like a magic spell had been cast over the whole thing, and when you asked some of these guys, it seemed to sap the life right out of them before your eyes. Garth, one of the more gregarious murderers on Jasper's block, had looked downright scared when he'd asked him about the visitation. "I can't say nothing," Garth said, "and neither will you once you go. It's a secret that you keep after that. It's something that changes you, and you keep going back till it does." What changes you?" Jasper had asked, but Garth wouldn't say any more. "Get away from me. Get away before he thinks I told you." He left in a hurry then, their chess game only 4 moves in, and Jasper found he had more questions than before. He supposed that all would be answered on Saturday, and as the days passed, he found himself a little excited about the whole idea of the thing. When Saturday night arrived, Officer Gage found him in his bunk, his best uniform still looking ragged as he waited for whatever might come. Gage held out a pair of cuffs, telling Jasper that he'd have to cuff him before he left. Jasper nodded, putting his hands behind his back, but Gage told him it was in the front this time. Jasper shrugged. It was his show, and let him cuff him in the front. Some of the guys who were still awake made suggestive noises as he left, some of them telling him to enjoy his night visit, but the older guys were noticeably quiet. Gage led him to the visitation area, a little spot behind staff check-in, and when Jasper shook the cuffs at him, Gage told him to sit down and put his hands on the eye hook on the table. There were a few guys in here, some of them Jasper knew, but most he didn't, and they all seemed to be cuffed to the protruding hook in the center of the table. Jasper started to buck, but realized it wouldn't do any good. Whatever this was, they'd have him, one way or another. He set his hands on the table, and Gage pulled a lock out of his pocket. He secured Jasper to the spot before leaving him in an all-fired hurry. Whatever was about to happen, Gage clearly didn't want any part of it. Jasper glanced around the room, taking in the men that sat around him. There were about 12 in all of them shackled to the table, and they were all spaced so that at least 3 chairs separated them from one another. Most of them looked confused or unsure, but a couple of them looked like they knew what was coming, knew and weren't looking forward to it. One of them, a big bald bruiser named Dennis, had his head against the table as he cried nakedly between his elbows. Another, who Jasper didn't know, was praying in fast Spanish. A third, Jasper thought his name might be Conroy, was thrashing around as he pulled at his bonds. His eyes were roving like a scared horse, and he kept pulling at his cuffs until he heard a lock click near the back of the room. Then he went still, and Jasper thought he saw him listening for something. A pair of double metal doors at the back of the room burst open then, and Jasper saw a small group walk in, unattended by guards. 2 of them were children, a pair of twins who looked ghostly under the dim fluorescent. One was a dark woman who sat down in front of the man who prayed. The last was a tall, homely woman who took the seat across from a younger inmate that Jasper couldn't put a name to. The young man stiffened as she sat down, and the pair were close enough that Jasper could suddenly see the woman's problem wasn't her face, but rather what was on it. She had a crop of mold growing from ear to ear, and as it wove around her eyes, it made it look like she were wearing glasses. "Hello, Emmanuel," she said, her voice thick, but not unhappy to see him. "I see prison has suited you." "The hell is this?" Emmanuel said, trying to back away and failing as the chains caught him. "You ain't real. You look like my ma, but you ain't my ma." "Course I am, Em. How else would I know how you drowned me in the bathtub? How else would I know what you did to me before you buried me in the basement? How else would I know how much you cried before you turned yourself in? You could feel me watching you from the corner of the room, and it ate at you until you just couldn't take it anymore. The way..." She leaned a little closer, looking at him mischievously, "that you ate at me after I was gone." The inmate started making a sound like someone choking on air. He kept pulling away from the woman, but the chains brought him up yet again. Jasper looked away, but he could see similar scenes of horror unfolding around him as more people joined them. The twins sat down in front of the sobbing man, but he wouldn't lift his head. He wouldn't look at them, couldn't look at them. But the longer Jasper looked, the more he could see the bruises around their necks. The deep, purple marks looked like individual fingers, and they seemed incapable of speaking through their bruised throats. They sat menacingly across from him, and every peek he gave them was followed by a hopeless cry of terror. Others came, men, women, children, mothers, fathers, wives, everything in between. The inmates' reactions were as varied as the specters. One man could only repeat the phrase, "I'm sorry," as a half-naked boy of 17 sat silently across from him. The mother and son he had seen first were now sitting with her hands on his as he rocked and shook his head in negation. What could only be an older man's parents asked if he were proud of what he'd done to them, but he only sat silently and stared right through them. Jasper wondered when it would be his turn, but he didn't have long to ponder. "Sorry I'm late, dear. The commute was dreadful." His breath came out as little more than a puff of smoke, and when he turned to look at her, Jasper could tell that it was Grace only by the necklace she wore. He'd given her that necklace for their 3rd anniversary, and he supposed her parents had left it on her when they buried her. Her face, a face he had loved so much, was gone. She looked like a burn victim, like a used-up matchstick, and the eyes that looked back at him glowed from empty sockets. Jasper wanted to scream, wanted to pull away, as her red and oozing hands came out to touch his, but he couldn't muster the strength. She was burnt, her beauty stolen in death, and that was his fault. After he'd blindsided her, begging for another chance, she had told him to get lost. She said she couldn't be with someone who wouldn't give her children, and suggested that he go back to his mom's house before her new boyfriend found them together. At the mention of her new boyfriend, he grabbed her by the neck and turned away, slamming her head against the wall of the stairwell outside her apartment. He had kept right on doing this until she stopped struggling, and even then, he did it a few more times. He only stopped when her head began to dribble something besides blood, and he realized he'd broken her skull. He was scared then, afraid that he would get caught, and when he put her in his car, he wasn't sure what he intended to do with her. The police had caught him in his parents' backyard, one of their neighbors having seen the whole thing, but by then, Grace had been a charcoal briquette. He'd heard the funeral had been closed casket, but apparently they hadn't closed it tight enough. "What's wrong, dear? Didn't you tell me you couldn't live without me? I believe it was a little bit before you smashed my head against the wall. I assumed that since you'd taken all that time to burn me, that you wanted me to look this way. Well, have a look, Jasper. See what you've done to your Grace." Every word she spoke sent flakes of her tongue and lips onto the table, onto his hands, onto Jasper's face. She was leaning in closer, bringing her horrible visage closer to his, and Jasper felt his sanity beginning to whimper. As she brought the remains of her blackened lips together, He added his scream to the others. As they pressed against his flesh, he let his eyes roll up to the whites. He tried to stay conscious, but the sheer horror of the situation was eroding his mind. This couldn't be. Things like this weren't real. Grace was dead. She couldn't come back to torment him. As he regained consciousness, he found that he was still chained to the table, and terrible Grace was still sitting across from him. "You seem to have gotten a little sleepy, my love. That's okay. The warden was nice enough to extend visitation for the whole night, and I was more than happy to come see my best fella." Jasper screamed until his throat broke, and when Gage opened the door at 5 o'clock, all those present were silent as the grave. Gage led them away like a flock of lambs, easily correcting them when they tried to stumble out of line. He'd been doing this for a while, 2 or 3 years at least, and he learned not to question what went on behind that door. He heard begging, heard screaming, heard the mad laughter of the deranged. And at the end of the month, he found an extra $500 added to his check for every midnight visitation he conducted. His smile curdled when he remembered what the warden had said to him when he gave him the position. "I know you're struggling to feed your appetites, and it's only a matter of time before you end up inside these walls for doing something foolish. Why not let me help you feed those urges, and in exchange, I won't tell anyone what sort of debauchery you get up to in your spare time." The warden was a weird one, but Gage had to admit he had always kept his promises. Gage wondered what he put those poor saps through, but quickly put it out of his mind. The warden's games were none of his concern, and how he chose to discipline his inmates was his business. Do you know what it's like to be trapped somewhere with no chance of getting out? Do you know what it's like to wonder if you'll wake up tomorrow on this side of the veil or not? These are things I've been struggling with while in prison, and it seems that a very different creature has come to Stragview. It's not a beast that the warden can control, and it isn't something his enforcers can threaten or lock away. It came in with a sneeze or a cough, riding on someone's shirt or hands, and it's spread through the compound like wildfire. The inmates call it K-flu, the guards call it the Erutious strain, and those who get it call out for death more often than not before it comes. It's a super aggressive lung infection, and if it's not treated properly, it literally drowns you in your own mucus. It started slow. A couple of inmates and a couple of guards could be heard coughing and hacking, but soon it was all over the compound. Dorms were quarantined. Inmates kept indoors once a few of them tested positive, and violence was never far away. I caught it 2 days before the Stragview riots, and it nearly got me killed. I'm not a violent man. I'm in prison for 5 years after a home my father left me collapsed, and I was unable to pay to have it cleaned up. I'm 24. I'm a high school dropout living paycheck to paycheck, and if I couldn't pay to have the place fixed up, how was I supposed to pay to have it cleaned up? I worked 6 days a week to keep my bills paid, and when the cops came to serve me court papers for criminal littering, I was shocked. I didn't even know that was a thing. I'll admit that I might have reacted badly. I didn't mean to bump the cop as he tried to push me against the car. I didn't mean for him to fall and break his elbow on the concrete stopper at the gas station I worked at. I tried to tell that to the judge, but he didn't care. I'd never been arrested in my life, but suddenly I had injured a Leo and got myself 5 years for assault and criminal littering. That's how I came to be sick inside of the high custody dorm. Now I almost got killed. When I woke up with a cough, I was suddenly very thankful that I didn't have a bunkie. My old bunkie had been taken to the infirmary a week before, and I bet he was the one who gave it to me. I managed to hide it for a day, but as it got worse, someone must have noticed. I woke up on the second day to find inmates pushing me out of my bunk as they took my stuff and put it by the door. It was afternoon. I'd slept through dinner as the fever started getting high, and I must have been coughing because they discovered my sickness. They put me on the door, telling the officer that I had to go, and threatening to hurt me if I didn't get out. "We aren't getting sick because you want to hack up a lung. Shouldn't have been swapping slobber with your old bunkie. Get the hell out of here, kid, before we make you feel even worse." They were backing me into the door, pushing me en masse, when the door opened and I saw 3 officers coming in to see what was going on. One of them shoved me towards an officer at the back, and he put me in cuffs and took me to confinement. I didn't know why I was going to the box, but I knew it was better than where I was leaving. "Sir, listen, I think I might be really sick. I need some medicine or something. Please, help me." "There's a whole wing and seg for guys like you so you can hack and cough together all night. Medical comes down all the time so you'll get all the care that you..." We both looked up as the siren started going off, and when the inmates in H-Dorm started pouring out, he ran me to confinement and locked us behind the gate. Inmates were howling for blood. Some of them hit the tall chain-link gate, and I was pretty glad I was inside. Some of the orderlies were standing on the sidewalk looking dumbstruck at the sight of so much chaos, and as the guards in G-Dorm came out to see, the officer who had brought me told them to back up because he had one more for quarantine. I was dragged down a little hall and tossed into a cell by myself. I asked him what was going on, but he just ran the door shut and opened the little flap, demanding I bring his cuffs back. I let him uncuff me, turning immediately to ask if a riot was going on, but he had closed the flap and ran off to help or hide or whatever he meant to do. I was left in the cell with no clue of what to expect, and no company, except for the hacking and screaming of those around me. The first night was the worst. I lay on the cold steel and listened to the sounds of the riot as it went on outside my window. They couldn't get past the barbed wire fence that surrounded segregation, so they took their frustration out in other ways. I smelled smoke a few times. Pretty sure they'd set one of the dorms on fire, but my cell faced away from the compound, and I couldn't be sure of what was going on. I would have complained about sleeping on cold metal, but it actually felt good against my skin as I lay there. The fever was rising, and I shivered and sweated in turn. I had been wearing my thermals when they took me in, which helped some, but as they soaked up my sweat, they didn't help my shivering much. Around me, people screamed and yelled, wanting food or medicine or someone to cuss at. No one came, though. Not that whole night, as far as I can recall. Whatever was going on outside the walls of my cell was beginning to peter out, and as order was restored, the compound became quiet. There was the occasional shotgun blast, the shouts and curses of those who refused to lie down, and the low hiss as someone put out a fire. I dragged myself to the sink once or twice, the toilet too, and at some point I fell asleep. I woke up to a guard banging on the door to tell me that lunch was there. Saw a brown paper bag on the floor of my cell and guessed that breakfast had come while I was asleep. Another bag joined it on the ground, but as I tried to sit up, my head spun. My mouth was full of cotton and my cheeks were hot to the touch. My cough sounded wet and felt thick in my throat. My breath was coming out ragged. I was much sicker than I had been the day before, and I tried to ask the officer when medical was coming around. He just closed the flap and moved on. I drank some water, my throat grateful for the moisture, but the food in the bag held nothing for me. I had no appetite, no desire to eat at all, and I went back to lying on my steel frame. I slept till night and then lay in the dark as I tried to get back to sleep. I was reeling in my own skin, feeling the heat baking off of me, and as I looked at the bottom of the bunk that hung above me, I started to see the lines there performing a play just for me. The various numbers and gang signs and names and other things that countless inmates had scratched there moved across the beige plains. They were like animals. They hunted each other, lived with each other, banded together, and as they went about their lives, all I could do was watch. I lay there, splayed out and panting, as the little play became my whole world. It all zoomed in, hyperfixating itself upon me, as I silently drank it in like manna. When someone called my name, I turned my head groggily and realized that a pair of eyes were looking at me through the flap. "Quincy? Roger Quincy?" she asked, sounding annoyed. That was me. I realized it was me, but I could have no more gotten up to see what she wanted than I could have told her the date and time. "Has he been like this the whole time?" she asked someone I couldn't see. "Pretty much. He came in right before the riot the night before." "Well, if he doesn't want his meds, I don't have time to worry with him." The flap shut, and they went on to the next cell. It didn't mean anything to me then, but thinking back on it now, it's odd to hear yourself spoken of like you don't matter or you can't manage for yourself. It was like being a child and hearing your parents talk about what was best for you. Though somehow worse, because you know that these individuals don't have your best interest at heart. You're meat to them, pure and simple, and I realize now that they wouldn't do much until I was dead or unresponsive. I was trapped, at their mercy, and as the door to the quad slammed shut, I went back to watching the pictures on the ceiling dance and play. The sun came up, but it didn't matter either. I lay in my sweaty clothes and baked in my fever. I couldn't move, I couldn't think straight. And when breakfast came, I heard the guard sigh as he told me to pick up my bags before they attracted ants. He moved on again, not bothering to ask how I was or if I was okay. I blinked, and it was dark again. When I coughed, I gasped in surprise when my air seemed strangled. My mucus had formed a pinprick for me to breathe through, and as I hacked to make the hole bigger, I spat up a glob of dark-colored phlegm. It wasn't red, but it was dark. Dark green. It made me feel a little sick. I tried to get up and drink some water, but my body was so weak I couldn't do much but roll off the bed and flounder on the concrete. I'd hoped that when one of the guards noticed me, they would get me some help. In that, I was disappointed. I don't know which guard it was, but the one who came by 20 minutes later looked in and rolled his eyes at me. I was halfway between the bed and the toilet, dragging myself forward with each painful pull, and when I heard him breathe out in exasperation, I looked up. We made eye contact for a few seconds, mine pleading with his unimpressed gaze, but he shook his head before walking on. He likely saw dozens of other inmates in the same state, some undoubtedly playing it up so they could get attention, or move to medical, or something as simple as a cold or hot shower. But at that moment, all I needed was for him to be a human being, and he failed me. I lay there on the ground, still dragging myself along like a dog, until I got to the sink. From the concrete floor, it looked as tall as Everest. But there was another option. My eyes began to leak as I looked at it, seeing the bowl of the steel toilet. But I could no more pull myself up to the sink than I could have pulled myself onto the top bunk. I did manage to flush it first, and the water inside was cold and not as gross as I would have thought. I splashed some onto my face, sucking it out of my mustache as it dripped into my mouth, and I lay back panting as my fever raged. The water hadn't done much to cool my fever, and I scooped a few more handfuls onto my face when I was able. It seemed to evaporate on my skin, and I could tell it was high by the way my vision swam. I had to be running at least 101, more like 102, and as I leaned against the wall, I felt myself time travel. I would blink and lose hours, watching the sun slide down one side of the cell to the other. That's why it took me so long to remember the man I saw leave segregation. It all had the dreamy feeling of something unreal, and when I heard the snap of the stretcher being opened, I pulled myself up to the window by sheer curiosity. Out in the block, the guards were wheeling a man out on a stretcher. He was lying in a strangely gauzy blanket, and I saw the nurse take his temperature and check his vitals. One of them took the stethoscope away and shook her head, the other zipping him into the bag and wheeling him away. I can't actually be sure this happened. It could have just been a fever dream, but I remember it with an oddly crystalline clarity that leads me to believe the memory was real. Morning meds never came, but when someone called my name later, I jerked awake and realized it was afternoon. There was another sack lunch on the floor, and ants were making a trail to it. Guess the guard had been right on that one. The flap was down, and the nurse was shaking a cup of pills for evening meds. I stuck my hand up so I wouldn't miss it, but the nurse did not spill them into my hand. "Where's your drink?" I looked at her, the words sounding like the reverb on a speaker, as I tried to make sense of them. "Your water. You need water to take your pills. Get your water." I looked at the sink, finding I had some strength left in my legs as I tried to put them under me. I shook like an old man, my balance tentative, and as I shuffled for the sink, the nurse spat at me to hurry up. When I got to the sink, I stood there for a few minutes, trying to figure out what was missing. Then it hit me. I don't have a cup," I half whispered. "Shut the flap," she yelled. "I don't have time for this nonsense." The flap was shut, and I was left standing at the sink until my shaking legs finally brought me down to the toilet. I started to cry. I was going to burn up in here. Was this where I would take my final breath? I took the opportunity to splash some cold water on my face, soaking my hair and shirt, which helped some. I was wet, but I was colder, and I started to shiver as I pulled the blanket off my bed and slept sitting on the toilet. When I woke up, I heard the faint sound of a different nurse as she passed out pills in the early morning. I had a minute to get ready, and I meant to be ready. I looked around for something to use as a cup, my eyes settling on a sweaty carton of milk that sat beside the door. I had missed the evening meal, it seemed, and the milk inside was warm and likely no good to drink. I dumped it out with shaky hands and filled it with water from the sink. After washing it a few times, I was just filling it again when the flap came down, and a pair of eyes peeked in. "Quincy?" she asked, and I shook my milk carton as I held out my hand. "Glad to see you're feeling a little stronger," she said, though she didn't sound glad. She pressed a few pills into my hand and closed the flap, her cart rumbling on as I lifted them to my mouth. I didn't even ask what they were. I swallowed them with some water from the milk carton, gagging as they stuck in my dry throat. I worried I was going to choke on them for a minute, filling the carton again as I drank more. The carton gave the water a mealy taste, but it was cold, and I was glad to have fresh water as opposed to toilet water. I leaned back then, waiting for the pills to do their work, and watched the wall as a play was put on for my amusement. The chips and nicks, the graffiti and pictures, they all became stars, constellations that danced and dipped just for me. They wove through a celestial byplay, telling the stories of their birth, their life, and their eventual death. I was spellbound by it all. I sat with my scratchy prison blanket pulled around me, like a homeless drunk, too gone to know he's watching nothing but air. When breakfast came, I forced myself to eat a little of it, and as the sun rose beyond the plexiglass, I passed out and time traveled again. I woke up as someone called my name for lunch, reached out so they didn't simply drop the tray on the ground, and found I had a little appetite. I ate a little food before falling asleep again. I woke up in the afternoon for meds, ate dinner, found I was a little stronger. Someone noticed I didn't have a mat and brought me one. Someone offered me a shower, and I took it. The hot water felt good as I stood underneath it, and I realized that I wasn't as unsteady as I had been. I went back to sleep when I was put back in my cell, and woke up when the nurse called my name so I could get my morning meds. Much like the constellations, I danced my own dance, and one day I woke up and realized I felt normal again. Whatever I had been afflicted with had passed, and I was deemed well enough to leave quarantine. I was given a shave and a haircut, and when they sat me down in the chair in the barber shop, I wondered who that hobo was in the mirror. My hair and beard had grown long while I was in the box, and I wondered how long I'd been in there. The compound looked different than when I'd gone in, but still much the same. Buildings had been repaired, the grass had regrown, and I guess that I'd spent a few weeks in segregation. While I sat, they decided that I might be better suited to an open bay dorm, and I was placed in E-dorm. That was the end of my time in quarantine. It wasn't years and years spent beyond the door, but sometimes I can still remember that odd time of my life. I could have easily died back there without anyone being the wiser, like the man I remember them wheeling out in a bag. But I didn't. I survived somehow, and now I'm afraid I will lose that time. Though painful, that's why I'm writing it down. I want to remember how I was treated, the way I was looked at as if I was a subhuman. So I remember not to treat others that way. I'll be released soon, God willing, and I never want to find myself in a place like this again.